Hello, my name is Horama, and today I have found 4 strange and creepy accounts of people's encounters with anomalous and mysterious creatures, and I will be narrating them here. I do hope you enjoy, and if so, then please press the like and subscribe buttons. But nonetheless, let's get on to the narrations. The first story has been submitted by user Mammoth Application 53. Every year, my friends and I go on a week-long canoe trip in Algonquin Park, usually to drink and fish. This past summer, we decided to stay on Tom Thompson Lake, if you know it, for our main site, which ended up being on an island in the middle of a lake. There were 6 of us in total, with one group of 4 in a large tent, one guy in a solo tent, and myself in a hammock between them. One night we had been huddled around a fire at about 1 a.m. when we noticed a flare in the sky over what we assumed was an adjacent lake. We didn't think much of it until an awful scream came across from the lake about 20 minutes later. I was the only one left sober at this time, and there wasn't much we could do, so we assumed it was the problem bear in the area that we'd been warned about at the outfitters. The strange part came after everyone had gone to bed. At 4 a.m., the other 5 guys went to their tents and passed out, while I lay in my hammock listening to them fall asleep. For reference, the group of 4 were about 30 feet to my right, and the other guy was about 100 feet to my left on the far shore. As I watched the stars and tried to will myself to sleep, I noticed everything had gone incredibly silent. Suddenly feeling creeped out, I slowed my breathing and stayed as still as I could, thinking about the possible bear and how I was a neatly wrapped meat sack hanging there. Then, I heard a voice call out about 20 feet to my left, by the remains of our fire. It was the voice of my friend, Seamus, who was one of the guys passed out in the large tent. 4 hellos, with each one sounding more emotionless. Hello? 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 Hello. All said within maybe 6 seconds. Although I immediately recognized his voice, every instinct I had was on alert, telling me not to respond. I stayed as quiet as a corpse for the next 5 minutes, listening for any movement, until I felt the tension leave the air. It disturbed me a lot to know how normally you can hear every movement in the site, and yet I heard absolutely nothing. The next morning, everyone told me they'd heard nothing, but we agreed to move sites early since we'd all gotten an eerie vibe from that night. This was our 6th trip to Algonquin, and we've never had any creepy experiences before. I hope that what I heard that night was a camper, with an identical voice to my friends, I guess, who had come to see if the site was free, or Seamus had somehow stealthily sleptwalk out of his tent, but neither seems possible. I 100% would have heard them moving. The second story has been submitted by user Amazing Shot. When I was in middle school, I coon hunted a lot, mostly with my dad, but I knew the hills and the hollers enough around our home in West Virginia that he would let me take friends. I could go anywhere I wanted, or the dogs let us, but I was told to shy away from this one old home place up in the hills. See, before the government owned it, my great-grandmother's people owned it. She lived to the age of 107 and died when I was 15. She would always tell us if the dogs head to the old Rooney place, come home, the dogs will come out on the other side of the creek, or backtrack you all back out. Well, one night me and my friend, Nubs, he's got 9.5 fingers due to a log splitter accident when he was 10, decided we were gonna hunt that hollow exclusively. He had to be a prize grade Akun up there. Nobody hunts it. We took off up the creek road on foot with 3 of the best dogs I've ever had. Jake, big broad blue tick with a cold nose, Slim Jim, hot nosed red tick, and Trapper John, mean bed-deviled, extremely talented hound. Now you know, when you get to the Rooney place, because it's this big flat at the end of the creek road with a big half-dead trees and piles of field stones about every 30 feet at random for about half a mile, that gradually turns up into a draw that peers out onto the fence of the mountains. This is before GPS collars or any of that stuff. I used my dad's old carbide lamp to walk by, and Nubs would use his dad's old wheat miner's light to spot way up the tree. We would let our dogs run till we heard them bellowing over those long ball barks to signify tree, and walk to the dogs and dispatch the coon. About 500 yards ahead, with a short chase, the dogs barked. We started walking toward them up in the mouth of the cove. Then the dogs took off again. This is not unheard of. A coon can jump a tree, come down another, and sneak off, and a circling dog picks up a fresh track and off they go again. This happened 6 more times in the next 2 hours. That was definitely weird, and then everything went silent. That's when I started shaking. I knew my dogs. I've watched 2 of them fight a bear. Nothing scared them. All the dogs came back to us with their tails tucked, heads low, and absolutely quiet. We were working on an exit plan when, you know when you shake a tree limb that it's rained on all night, and all the raindrops fall off all at once and hit the ground? That happened about 20 yards behind me, only this was a big oak, about 75 feet to the first limb. While we were trying to see what was in that tree, damned if the same thing didn't happen to the tree we were standing under, when Trapper John pissed himself at my feet. I knew we had to get the hell out of that hollow. We backed out of there and ran home as fast as we could. Never hunted near the Rooney place again. I can't say for sure what was in that tree, but to me it looked like a man running through the treetops. It was years before I ever ventured in that place in the daylight. Did a little digging at the courthouse when I was in college. Come to find out, it was a logging town when the Spanish flu came through. Had a mill and everything. The flu killed so many people in that town that there wasn't enough living to bury the dead. My hometown's people went up and buried the dead. If you take a black crayon and a piece of paper and scroll it on the biggest rock of the pile, it's names of the dead buried there. My great-great-grandmother's dad bought it, burned the last of the structures, and farmed it for the rest of his life. When he died, my great-great-grandmother and her brothers sold it to the government. It's part of the Monongahela National Forest now. The third story has been posted by user OutrageousSilver622, and it is yet another story by the same person whose other encounters I narrated in my previous video. Before I dive into it, I want to address a couple of things that I feel need be addressed. This is my 3rd post. I can understand how, from an outside perspective, the events I'm posting here are beginning to sound a tall order. Who experiences this many bizarre, disturbing paranormal incidents in the space of 6 or 8 years? Since I was a teenager, I have done my very best to stay away from populated areas. I am passionate about the outdoors, not big on people, and have intentionally gravitated towards areas that are at least rural, but often wilderness. Strange things happen away from the places people frequent. If I lived in downtown New York or Toronto or Los Angeles and spent 15 years doing my best to stay in rough inner city areas, I would probably have just as many stories about shootings, carjackings, break-ins, and that sort of thing. But I've spent 15 years doing my damnedest to stay away from places like that, and stories like these are the statistical result of that lifestyle choice. I've added verification photos on my profile, both in government uniforms and in street clothes, to add credence to my story, because I want people who have never experienced stuff like this to understand that real, bizarre things can and do happen to regular people. People who have experienced the same or similar to feel a level of comfort in knowing that I am the real deal and that they can speak freely about the things our experiences have in common. I am sticking my neck out for the sake of veracity. I don't want to be identified. I don't want people I know in real life who may see this start doing the math. Don't pry. If you think you know me in person, no, you do not. I don't want to talk shop about what park I work for, what I do, or the town I live in. I don't want to play guessing games. Respect my privacy, please. I've given lots of info. That's all the info there is. Now, on to what happened. Late last year, I moved out to West Alberta to take a government job in the Rocky Mountains working for a national park. My job involves working hands-on in the park and in some ways is similar to being a bylaw officer. The reason this is relevant is because I spend a lot of time with my boots quite literally on the ground, getting paid to drive back and forth over the Continental Divide. I know the park and its surroundings like the back of my hand at this point. I am highly aware of the animals and plants that live here. I am comfortable in the backcountry, maybe more than I have ever been, and I know what kind of things one can expect to encounter in these forests and where. It was a beautiful sunny day in about mid-June of this year. Spring had finally begun, and the weather was starting to get nice. It was about 15 degrees. I had an unexpected day off of work. My girlfriend had had a half day, and so I got the bright idea of picking her up from work and taking her to an area called the Spray Valley. I wasn't really up for a big hike that day, but I had read online that there was a viewpoint along Highway 742 that offered an amazing view of Mount Assiniboine, the most prominent mountain in that part of the Rockies. And so I thought it might be a good place to drive and check out for something to do. The easiest way to get to the valley is, if you're already in the mountains, is to take the 742 from the town of Canmore, following it over White Man's Gap, a pass that traverses the saddle between two large peaks. As soon as we got up to elevation, it was pretty apparent that spring had sprung to a way lesser extent up here. There was still some lingering snow on the slopes, though the road was clear and we were shocked to see the mountain goats licking the salt from the trail in front of us, which is totally unheard of at such a low elevation, as they're typically high up in the subalpine and alpine areas where there are no roads. Late snowmelts will do this, as there is just no way for them to be in their usual habitat when it's inundated with snowpack. This becomes important later. Calling the 742 a highway is pretty damn generous. It's really just a gravel, two-lane snaking deep into the backcountry. The whole area around the Spray Valley has a reputation for being less tourist or family friendly, and can be somewhat dangerous to reach depending on the weather of the pass. It's way more remote than most car-accessible areas adjacent, and often has harsher conditions. As a result, it sees way fewer people than any other nearby parks, and that day was no exception, especially given that winter was hanging on to some extent at altitude. But we noticed as we got further and further away from the comparatively busy section by the pass that we weren't really seeing anybody at all. We drove for an hour and change, and soon we went from passing a couple of cars every 15 or so minutes to literally being the only ones on the road. The parking lots at the roadside day use areas were completely empty. We arrived at the viewpoint. I threw it in park at the edge of the road, and we got out of the truck. What struck me most was just how quiet things were. Aside from the sound of birds and our own voices, we were well and truly alone. The valley was long and wide, and with the mountains at a reasonable distance from the highway in both directions, there wasn't much opportunity for an echo. We had long shot of visibility in each directions down the highway, and there was clearly nobody around. Moreover, all the cars we had passed on the way had kicked up a lot of dirt from the gravel on the dry valley floor, which can be quite arid due to the rain shadow of the peaks around it, and there wasn't a speck of it to be seen. No dust clouds, no sound, no approaching cars. When I say we were alone, I mean that. Every sense confirmed this fact. I had downloaded the area on Google Maps before we lost cell signal, and so I opened it up to check what was nearby. There were a couple of alpine trailheads in either direction, probably unusual, the snow sticking around, and a closed, seasonal helipad about 2 kilometers across a canyon. No wonder the lack of crowds. We spent 10 or 15 minutes admiring the view, took some pictures, and walked over to a pond at the edge of the road, and sat there for a bit while my girlfriend, a herbalist, admired some of the plants, noting how much smaller and earlier they were in the growing season than the plants now were part of the Rockies. Before long, we noticed across the pond, about 100 feet from the highway, there was a small outbuilding. Even though the Spray Valley has much less infrastructure than other areas due to the low volume of visitors, it still does have some facilities like bathrooms at trailheads, and so we assumed that that's what it was. Curious about what the trailhead it was, we walked back to our truck and cruised back toward the parking lot we had seen just a minute or so before we had parked. I pulled in once again. This lot was empty. No dust, no cars, not even any obviously disturbed gravel from 4x4 tires or anything like that. I remember this clearly because I was kind of reveling in how alone we were, since I'm used to wrangling tourists and giving out citations. We got out of the truck, and suddenly I was hit with this familiar sense of unease. Other outdoorsmen will know what I mean. I've spoken to hunters, wardens, guides, and other people who get it too. What I mean is that usually I just know when there's a bear around. I don't think it's anything supernatural. My guess is that I can smell them or something, and don't realize it consciously. I had that sense of vigilance wash over me, and so I reached into the center console and grabbed my bear spray and attached it to my belt. I stopped for a minute, my girlfriend close by, while I listened to see if I could hear anything. I couldn't, so we approached the beginning of the trail. It was a long, even clear-cut grassy area and reminded me more of the type of double tracks you'd see in the flatlands than a mountain trailhead. It was so wide that the park had actually placed a couple of granite slabs in front of it to keep people from taking motor vehicles down it. We read the map on the sign and we both took a few pictures of our surroundings standing on the slabs, when suddenly we heard a sharp crack about 20 to 25 feet away from us in the forest to our right. The forest was thick, dense, mossy, and surprisingly damp for a valley that was dry enough for dust cloud to hang in the air for minutes after a vehicle passed by. There was just about zero visibility beyond the first few trees. The crack itself immediately concerned me, because it sounded to me like the type of crack you'd get from breaking in half one of those first pieces of wood you'd put on a fresh campfire, bigger than kindling, a decent-sized branch from the sound of it. And so, whatever made the noise needed to have some weight or strength to have broken something that large. I immediately put myself between my girlfriend and the forest, and we called out to see if somebody was there. I heard nothing, and so, assuming it was an animal, I started yelling the typical stuff we're taught to yell when a bear is around in the backcountry, as they're intentionally socialized with rubber bullets to run when confronted. I clapped 5 times in quick succession. About 7 seconds passed, and something in the forest, 20 or 25 feet away, clapped back twice, slowly and deliberately. I have large, thick palms. I measured them as I was writing this all down, to get an idea of how big my hands actually are, spread wide, as if I was about to clap. They're 8 by 5 inches. They have a distinctive sound because of their size, and whatever it was that clapped back to us sounded extremely similar. So, something at least my size was physically clapping at us, or something that was able to mimic the sound I made perfectly. I mentioned before that due to the width of the valley, there wasn't really any room for the type of echo you might get in a narrow gully or up on the pass. Also, echoes don't have that natural, shimmering reverb that decays over time as the sound waves bounce back at you. What we heard certainly did not. It was real clapping in real time. It took about 2 seconds flat for me to go from standing next to the signal to half dragging, half carrying my girlfriend back to the truck. We paused with our backs against the vehicle, straining to see into the woods from across the parking lot, trying to hear what we could hear. I don't remember what I yelled, but I yelled something to let whatever was standing over that it wasn't a welcome, and we got in the truck and I peeled out. My girlfriend was very upset. I was pretty shaken myself, and I wasn't really keen on being in backcountry anymore. The whole drive back toward the pass we felt off, as if we were being watched, and even though it was a warm, sunny day, the atmosphere was hostile and weird. We stopped at a picnic area by the Spray Lakes further up the valley to see if we could make a palate cleanser, but I just couldn't relax and was quite on edge the whole time. We still talk about it frequently, and everybody I've spoken to with serious backcountry experience is equally as puzzled by what I experienced. A few of the friends I have interested in the paranormal have noted that crawler-like creatures and Sasquatches are both known to mimic people, debunking a few explanations I or other people have raised. A hiker messing with us. As I mentioned before, there was absolutely no evidence of any vehicle nearby, and many of the trailheads in the area were difficult or impossible to access due to the late melt. For sure, nobody could have gotten there without a vehicle. Even a cycling trip would have taken at least half a day, maybe longer, from any population center nearby. There is no through hike that connects to the trail in question. Also, the general etiquette here in the backcountry, because of what a hostile environment it is to make your presence known and address other hikers when you see or hear them. Somebody who lived back there. No doubt there are people who live in secluded areas of the Rockies and eke out a living poaching, foraging, or bringing supplies back from town. I have quite literally found their camps myself, but with a valley as wide as the Spray, there was zero reason for them to be so close to a trailhead or the highway. There's plenty of water sources further into the bush, and given the late growing season, there was no special wild edible like berries or spruce tips that might have attracted them. a beaver slapping its tail on the pond. A beaver slap is very distinct, wet, flat, and surprisingly loud. It sounds more like hitting a noodle or a flutterboard on the surface of a pool. This was a crisp, fleshy sound, and it wasn't coming from the pond beside us. It was right there in front of us in the woods. There was no sign of another human being within 25 kilometers in any given direction from where we were that day, possibly further. No noise, no dust, no cars, and no bikes. No voices, no footsteps, no reason for anybody to be there so early in the season, with the snow still on the slopes. I can't help but think that whatever we disturbed was trying to communicate with us. But I'm very glad we didn't stick around to find out what it wanted, curious or malevolent as it may have been. The fourth story has been posted by user SoyJacob27. I live in the northern part of North Carolina, and I needed to get off my chest the two encounters don't involve me but other family members and friends. My best friend was dropping me off at home, and she suddenly changed her tone and started yelling and telling me to get inside fast, and then she drove off. She said she saw a hovering type figure with no face, but it was wearing a suit, and it sounded odd to me until my sister said she saw something similar. It deeply freaked me out because they don't really talk to each other, and my friend is more skeptic when it comes to these type of things, but she stands by to what she saw today. My sister and her fiancé both talked about seeing an all-white figure run across the road near their house on two separate occasions when they were both alone. They live in a heavily wooded rural area near the Roanoke River. My sister was staying at my house, and in the room she was sleeping in, she told me her bed and furniture shaking and something pulling on blankets. I myself am Catholic, so I suggested we pray the rosary, and she agreed. She has told me nothing else has ever happened in my house after that, but she did mention weird stuff happening on their own property. Things making noise on their own, pets acting strange, etc. I find it hard to believe them sometimes, but when I wanted to ask more about it, they would always stare off into the distance and act quiet, like they were zoned out or something. And that made it even more creepy, since they were both the loud, cheerful, and joking type. I don't really worry about this stuff, but I would like to start camping sometime soon and do more outdoor activities. When I stay over on that piece of land there, is just something so eerie about the air there. They have problems with coyotes in the area, so I try to rationalize that might have something to do with it. The coyotes are loud and they howl, but something is even creepier when they are silent. But a shiny white figure with no face crawling and leaping over the road at night? Can someone please help identify this? Even if it's paranormal or some natural, undiscovered creature or something, I don't care. I have experienced what that place is like, and it gives me the creeps. Thank you. Other encounters they describe that could possibly be something else include my sister riding down their driveway and hearing something chasing her. She has a long driveway that goes into the woods. Jars making clinking noises on their own. And cats staring and focusing on something on the wall or on the ceiling in a tracking manner, but for no visible reason. Every single day, more and more people share their experiences with the paranormal, and while it's nearly guaranteed that most of these stories and encounters are misidentifications of common animals or simply outright fake, I do sincerely believe that at least one out of every 10,000 fake stories is a real one, and the person who reported it truly did see something. But the question is, do we truly wish to live in a world together with such beings?